Welcome to the 𝘚𝘵𝘠𝘥𝘪𝘵 podcast. My name is 𝘚𝘠𝑕 𝘠𝑚𝑦𝑙. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to share a resource for those interested in creating or enhancing your organizational wellness program. I have partnered with Justice Clearinghouse to create Building a Wellness Program from the Ground Up, a 10-module course I developed in response to questions and inquiries I've received over the years. When I first started down the path of researching organizational wellness programs, there weren't a lot of resources out there, and it would have been really helpful to me to have a guidebook or resource to walk me through the necessary steps. I share what I've learned over the past decade about creating and implementing a program, what worked well, challenges, culture, engagement, funding, identifying a wellness coordinator and team, what programs to include, strategy, launching the program, and the importance of agency leadership's buy-in, and much more. I will include a code in the show notes just for podcast listeners. One more thing I'd like to mention. Earlier this month, I had the opportunity to present my Women's Health and Resilience class to two groups of women at the WIFL conference in Alexandria, Virginia. That's the Women in Federal Law Enforcement Conference. It was such a blast, and I appreciated the enthusiasm and energy of the women who attended. I had such an amazing time connecting with women from across the nation, seeing old friends, and meeting trailblazers who paved the way for women in law enforcement. To hear women speak about the challenges and resistance they faced and the stories of their determination and fortitude were so inspiring for me. Stay tuned because some of those women may be appearing on the podcast in the very near future. Now on to today's show. Kristofor Healey is a speaker, author, and former DHS Special agent who spent more than 15 years in federal law enforcement. He is also the host of the Stoic Responder podcast, where he uses his experiences in law enforcement and endurance racing to teach Stoic lessons on leadership and overcoming adversity. He had no plans for a career in law enforcement, but after 9/11, Kris put aside his plans and his purpose shifted as he pursued his career in federal law enforcement. In this conversation, we discuss his career and then transition to discussing his new book, In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. Kris was first introduced to the Stoic philosophy when he was a freshman in college and discusses how it helped him throughout his career. He provides an explanation of the philosophy and explains that it was born out of hard times and is based on the virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance or moderation, and justice. Stoicism can be distilled down to the concept of focusing on what we can control rather than the external or what we cannot control. Kris tells us how Stoicism grounded him during a very chaotic 3-year period in his career when he uncovered a criminal conspiracy involving his own supervisor and colleagues. We talk about the philosophy and how it is such a great tool for all first responders. I had the opportunity to read some of his book before we spoke, but have been reading it even more since that time. The book is organized so that there's an entry for every day of the year. Each month has a theme such as truth, discernment, and consistency. I've been enjoying using this book as a resource, a gentle reminder that I often need to shift my mindset and perspective. Each day has a quote, a reflection that integrates the daily theme, and then a journaling prompt. I encourage you to check out Kris's podcast, The Stoic Responder. Similar to the book, each episode has a theme, a Stoic teaching or quote, and its application to current day. And the best part is that it's free. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the 𝘚𝘵𝘠𝘥𝘪𝘵 podcast. Today, I'm going to speak with former HSI agent, author, father, public speaker, just all of the things. Kristofor Healey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. You know, you and I have spoken before. I've been a guest on your podcast. And we have a lot of similar viewpoints and perspectives. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about your new project and book. And before we get started, probably similar to how you start out your conversations with your podcast, could you just kind of introduce yourself? And in particular, if you don't mind, telling the listeners how you decided to embark on a career in law enforcement.
Sure, sure. I'll give the 30,000 yard view.
There you go.
Yeah. So for me, I had every intention of being an archaeologist. I actually went to college at the University of Maine. I got my degree in anthropology. I graduated. I went to work for one of my professors, and I had budgeted a year off to work for a professor in the field before going back to my graduate program the following fall. And that year that I was off, it happened to be 2001. I graduated college in 2001, and I found myself working in the field doing archaeology field work on September 11th. And that was when, for me, I would say the moment really didn't hit me until a few days after 9/11, when the names of people that were from Maine, where I grew up, started to come in. We started to recognize and realize there were people from towns I grew up in. We started to realize that the terrorist, Mohammed Atta in particular, had flown out of the Portland International Jetport. He had eaten at the Pizza Hut the night before 9/11 that my best friend was a waiter at. They had bought the box cutters and the duct tape at the Walmart that my family shopped at. And all of that just, it felt so close to home, and it hit me so hard that I called the FBI office down in Boston. And I called up and said, "Are you guys hiring?" Because when you're not in law enforcement, what do you think of when you think of the federal government? You just, it's the bureau. That's what you know. And I called, and the guy was like, "Do you speak Farsi? Do you speak Pashtun? Do you speak Arabic? Do you speak Urdu?" And of course, no, I speak a little French, if that helps. And he's like, "No, unless you're, like a Delta Force operator or a forensic accountant, unless you speak those languages, we're really not hiring right now." And but he did tell me, he said, "Listen, they're already starting to kick the tires on this new department, this concept of standing up the Department of Homeland Security." It was at that point, it was already, I think, called the Office of Homeland Security. They had brought in Tom Ridge to advise President Bush and all that stuff, and they were starting the congressional process, as you well know, of creating that Franken agency out of the Treasury Department and Justice Department, all that stuff. And so as soon as because of course when they started the department, they had to cross-train everybody. They had to send everybody back to FLETC, so all the INS people had to get customs trained and vice versa. And once that was over, they started bringing new people in. And as soon as those job announcements came out, I shotgunned out applications to anything that had an immigration focus, because I thought, these guys overstayed visas, they attacked us on 9/11. I want to be a part of whatever agency is going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so it was Border Patrol, what was then CBP OI, I think it was called at the time, not HSI. And then it was at the time it was called BICE, right? You remember that? Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Yes.
And then ATF got mad about that. And FBI, you can't be a bureau and all that stuff. But so I shotgunned out applications to all of them, and I was probably one of the first guys to go through FLETC as a new DHS employee, not a cross-trained DHS employee going back and being retrained. But I just said, I'll take whatever job gets offered to me first. And the first people that called me were ICE, and it's now called ERO, Enforcement Removal Operations. At the time, it was called Apprehension, Detention, and Removal Operations, something like that. But basically, all of the job announcements at the time were like, "Come fight terrorism, join DHS." And I was like all in on that. And then they sent me down to the southwest border, and there really wasn't much terrorism fighting. It was mostly Northern Triangle countries and Central American removal teamwork. So, but that was it. Yeah, I started out with ICE. I worked for them for about 3.5 years, got picked up with the Office of Inspector General, which is the internal affairs for Homeland Security. Went to CITP, got trained up as a special agent after doing immigration work, and then became a special agent, and then spent the rest of my career working for DHS OIG on the border for about 10 years, and then moved inland, got into San Antonio, ended up in Houston, and that's where I ended my career.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you for that. And when I talk to you, just like the last time, it brings up all these memories, because that's such a part of my past. Because for the listeners who don't know, I was a special agent for Immigration and Naturalization Service, which no longer exists. Right. And I joined in 1996, and it's actually how I met my husband. And then my husband kind of went on to see the iteration of all of the things that you just mentioned that I heard about at home, because I only spent a couple of years with the agency and then transitioned into local law enforcement. And it's funny, because I asked him this morning, I said, "Well, what kind of things should I ask my guest about? Because you guys were with the same agency." And he's like, "Well, I was there during a very different time." And he had a very different experience, because he is OG, old school immigration. Yeah. And so, he started in 96. and he saw those transitions, but he did not. He stayed pretty true to working immigration and removing criminals and working with local law enforcement. But he did see all of those changes because his office began to expand, and these different areas started to come in. So so yeah, it's kind of funny to hear you talk about all of that. And I really, I appreciate the explanation because oftentimes, you know, people get into this line of work and it's something that they knew they wanted to do from a young age, or it's something they did because of job stability, they just kind of fell into it. But I love how you very specifically got motivated and inspired to do something, and you did it, because not a lot of people have the courage to do something like that, especially because you had a plan. You were going to go back to school. You were already doing something in the field that you went to college for. So I commend you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. It was, it's funny, like they say, do what you love in college, right? You go and you get a degree that you're passionate about. And I always, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in an area that's thick with history. I know you're from that part of the world as well. So I went down to Civil War battlefields and Revolutionary War battlefields, and my dad and I would go to museums. And there was just, when you grow up in New England, the town I grew up in was founded in 1630. So you just grow up around so much history that I loved history. I enjoyed it. And of course, being a child of the 80s and 90s, you see Indiana Jones and you think, that's cool. I want to be that guy. And that was really my attitude. And it never even dawned on me or occurred to me that law enforcement was a career path that I might go towards until 9/11. And then it was like a political awakening too for me. It was like, wait, how did this happen? How do we allow this to happen? All of a sudden I became very engaged in the not the politics of it necessarily, but the civil things that I had always just ignored. Who is in charge matters. The policies matter. I was 21, 22 years old. I'd never thought about those things, and all of a sudden I'm deeply concerned about our immigration policy. I'm deeply concerned about the impact that has on us as a society because of what happened on 9/11. I was on a podcast the other day. It's called the Police Applicant Podcast. We were having a discussion about some of the trouble that the Department of Homeland Security had when they were first standing up, because they doubled the size of Border Patrol, which you probably remember. And Border Patrol came over from DOJ to this new agency, this new department, and there was a lot of growing pains. And in that, there was a lot of opportunity for people to get pushed through the hiring process that probably shouldn't have been hired.
Right.
And a few years down the road, me as an internal affairs investigator, I was dealing with a lot of those problem hires. And it was interesting having this conversation with these guys because the synergy of what they're dealing with today in terms of police applicants, in terms of lowering standards because there's not enough people applying. We had kind of the opposite problem. We had too many billets and we needed to lower the standards a little bit to get more people through the door. But it's, 2 decades down the line, things haven't changed all that much. There's a lot of the same problems, a lot of the same issues that are happening. And so I know your husband dealt with what the customs guys call it the hostile takeover, and so there's a lot of sore feelings when I came on board about I was legacy INS, I was legacy customs. I don't want to do this sort of work. I remember going into like the processing area at it was an old INS station at Harlingen, Texas, that had become the new ICE office, and it was like a rack office, like a resident agent in charge office. And I was in the processing area, and I remember having been trained on, how to do intake when I was at the academy, and sitting there and doing that, and having like customs guys be so angry because they didn't want to enroll an alien, and so they were like, "You take care of this guy, you do that, new guy." And so like there's a lot of bad blood there that people don't realize now. And then there's a lot of people coming in now from the podcast I was on the other day where they're saying the new applicants coming on board, they were all 19, 20, 21 years old. They didn't even live through 9/11. They have no idea any of this history or any of these issues. This is the world that they live in now. And that kind of made me pause and say, oh my goodness, one, I'm getting old. Two, just life has changed so much since those days. And we lived in such a different world back in the early 2000s than we live in now.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because, I've said this before, but I really think that I need to connect you with my husband because you're mentioning these 20, 21-year-olds. He and I are both retired from our law enforcement careers now, but he is currently an adjunct professor in a Homeland Security 4-year college program here locally at our Wichita State University. And we talk about this a lot because his students, they weren't alive when 9/11 happened. And he often will bring up, his own experience, current events, and in his Intro to Homeland Security class, he teaches an immigration class. So he talks about the same thing, getting people to understand how impactful that really was, because it's hard when it's kind of like how we were when we were studying history as kids. It doesn't feel real because it was back then, it was a different time.
Yeah, I think a lot about. I was born during the Carter administration, right? So I
Hmm.
think about like um, things that were major events right before I was born, like I don't know, like Watergate or the gas shortages or the Iran hostage situation, which was happening when I was just a baby. And I think about how those were impactful to my parents and people of that generation. And that's what the kids going into police jobs, I say kids, but that's what the young adults going into police jobs now think of 9/11, right? They don't have a real context for it. And that was so impactful to my life that I just assume that everyone coming up behind me, it's impactful to them as well. And what you don't realize is the further you get removed from a historical event, the less impact it has on the people who are coming up the line behind you. And you start to notice that as the agencies change, as the mission changes, as you get further from a historical event that was so deeply impactful into how and why we enforce the border the way we do. And here we are 20 years plus removed from that. And it's a lot of those lessons seem to have been forgotten. So, yeah, there are times when I miss working for Homeland Security, but then I have conversations like this, and I think I'm like, no, your time has come. It was good while it lasted, but that perspective, it no longer needs to exist, right? Other people have it now. So
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's actually a really great segue into what I want to talk about next is how you kind of stumbled upon or started to integrate the philosophy of Stoicism into kind of what you did during your career. Because I did read the beginning part of your book, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And I appreciated the explanation into kind of how all of that came to be. So if you don't mind speaking to that, and if you also don't mind, maybe just giving a really kind of blanket explanation for someone who doesn't know anything about Stoicism, what it is, and we'll kind of go from there.
for sure, yeah, I'll start there. I probably picked up Stoicism for the first time as a freshman in college when you take philosophy 101 and you just kind of you've got Marx and Foucault and Plato and all this other stuff getting thrown at you, and a lot of that is very academic, it's very didactic, it's very scholastic in nature. It's intended, when you're talking about Plato's cave and all that stuff, it's a very academic exercise. Stoicism and picking up a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, he was the emperor of Rome in the 2nd century. He was the most powerful man in the known world, and he wrote a journal every single day to practice his philosophy, and his philosophy was Stoicism. And he basically was writing a journal to himself to remind himself to be humble, to be decent, how to be a good man, how to be a good leader. And that journal survives to this day, and it's the historical text that we know as Meditations. And the philosophy that he was practicing is a very lived philosophy. It's based on this theory, this central theory that we don't control everything, and we have to focus specifically on that which we control. We can divide the entire world up into 2 categories: that which we control, that which we do not. And the things that we control that are within our control, our actions, our attitudes, our reactions, our effort. If we just focus on those things, we can live in much greater harmony with the world around us, and we can have a much more practical life, a much more calm life. We can have much greater emotional resilience because we accept that the world doesn't care about us. We have to focus on the present moment and doing what is right and living in accordance with cardinal virtues and focusing on that which we control. And so it's such a refreshing view because we are so bombarded every single day with external stimulus, and we're constantly feeling pulled around by the things that are happening around us. And when you can really focus inward and focus on making sure that you are doing the best that you can to live a life in accordance with certain virtues and certain values, you live a better life when you let some of that external go. And so it's a very practical philosophy. I picked it up for the first time in college, and then you kind of set it aside, and you move on, you do other things. But when hard times happened in my life and when tough times have happened in my life, I've always gone back to it because it has such a rooting message. It puts you right in the chair with the Emperor of Rome 2,000 years ago as he's writing his journal, telling himself, you're going to run into people every single day that are going to make you angry, that are going to have ill intent. Treat them kindly, treat them well. The best revenge is not to be like them. Just these simple, practical pieces of advice that he's giving himself about living a good life, being a good man, being a good leader. I always find value in that. And so anytime that I've gone through challenging times in my life, I've found that. And law enforcement is a challenging career. You're operating in a fast, uncertain, and rapidly evolving environment all the time. You are constantly being pulled in a million different directions. There's constantly chaos around you. You're constantly expected to calm every scene. You're constantly supposed to be the port in a storm for other people. So you have to practice something that gives you that emotional resilience, that gives you that ability to control what you can control, to be a steady presence in a chaotic scene. And I've found in my career that this philosophy did a great job of getting my head right, getting my mindset in the right place so that I could be that for the people around me. And when it mattered the most to me, and I won't get into the long story of it, when it mattered the most to me was when there was a scandal in my office, and I ended up blowing the whistle on my own boss, my own special agent in charge. He ended up going to jail for 37 months. FBI tore apart our office, investigated our office. Another one of my colleagues went to jail for a year. Several guys got forced into resigning or retirement. Other guys got scattered to different offices, and it was a very chaotic 3-year period after I blew the whistle on this criminal conspiracy that I uncovered. And I found so much strength in those lessons in Marcus Aurelius' writing, in the other Stoics, Epictetus and Seneca and Zeno and Chrysippus and Cleanthes, that for me, as I got to the end of my career, I thought, boy, it sure would be nice if I had had a book that I could hold on to that just gave me some of those quick hit mindset lessons on a daily basis, that gave me some ways that I could integrate those lessons, a journal prompt or an action prompt telling you to go do X, Y, and Z to kind of integrate these lessons. I wish I'd had something like that. I looked at books like The Daily Stoic. I looked at other books, and I thought, it'd be great if there was something for police. It would be so cool if somebody would write this. And I figured, I guess somebody has to. So I did. But that's the long way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you did. So the name of your book that just recently got released is In Valor. Can you kind of fill in the rest? It's 365 daily meditations.
365 Stoic meditations for first responders. Yeah, and of course, In Valor is a reference to, if you've ever been to the National Law Enforcement Memorial, there's that quote from Tacitus that's on the wall there that says, "In valor there is hope." I have always loved that. I actually have that tattooed on my forearm. It's just one of those reminders to me that people who do this job, people who have a law enforcement job, are doing this for their fellow citizens, for the community. If you've ever been to Police Week activities, if you've ever been to the National Law Enforcement Memorial, you've seen the families of the people whose names are on that wall. If you know people whose names are on that wall, which I do, you realize how impactful it is and how important it is for people of valor. And valor is another way of saying courage. It's a synonym for courage. So people to have the courage to stand up and do the right thing for their fellow citizens, I think, is one of the most incredible and important things that anyone can do. And so I wanted to make a reference to that. And of course, Tacitus was a historian. He was a Roman historian who was around in the 1st century AD, around the same time as Marcus Aurelius was writing Meditation. So I thought it was an important kind of, reference and callback to that era that this philosophy comes from.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that, because most people don't really understand the rich history behind Stoicism. People have heard of the term, and, quite frankly, I was guilty of this too, thinking of being a Stoic, right? Because law enforcement, they use the adjective as like almost apathetic or unemotional. And I appreciate that you explained really what the philosophy really is all about, because it isn't that. And
no, it's not. Yeah, and I'll say just real quick, the philosophy is born of hard times, right? Mm-hmm. So we think of Marcus Aurelius as kind of the most famous Stoic, but it predates him by about 300 years. And so if you're familiar with your classics, if you've studied Western civilization at any point in your life, you're familiar with Alexander the Great. He kind of united the Greek Empire, and when he died in his early 30s, there was a period of decline in Greece, in the city-states of Greece, that's known as the Hellenistic period. And that is when this guy Zeno founded this school of philosophy that was essentially a reaction to these hard times. How do we get through hard times societally? How do we get through hard times, challenging times when we're rudderless, when we're leaderless, when there's all these challenges, these things happening, this cultural decay around us? Well, that was what Stoicism was intended to address. It was intended to address all of this is outside of our control. All of this chaos is outside, but we can control internal factors, and we can still live a good life. We can still live with what the Greeks called eudaimonia, the good life. And so it's really born of chaotic times. If you think about that, if you're a law enforcement officer right now in 21st century America in 2024, it is a chaotic time to be in this career. We have staffing shortages. We have political pressures. We have people saying, defund the police, get rid of the police. We have people saying, defund ICE, defund the Border Patrol. We have 2.48 million people crossed our border illegally last year. We have all of the downstream impacts of that, of all of these people landing in communities around the country. There is a chaotic scene happening right now. We have, in my area, in the Houston area, we have prosecutors who are letting people walk on violent crimes that they should be prosecuted for, and they're going back out as recidivists. And so if you're tasked with maintaining that thin blue line we talk about between order and chaos, you are living in a very chaotic time and operating in a very chaotic time. So if you ask yourself, what do these ancient philosophers have to teach me? What can the Emperor of Rome teach me, a beat cop in Sugar Land, Texas? What can the Emperor of Rome or this merchant from Greece teach me? Well, they built this philosophy in chaotic times. Marcus Aurelius, during his reign, he had a war on his eastern front against the Parthian Empire, which is modern-day Iran. He had a war on his northern front against the Germanic tribes who were crossing their border illegally and raiding into Rome, and he was trying to fight them back and have some sort of functional border control on their northern border, not southern. But they had a plague going on. They had the Antonine Plague that killed 7.5 million Romans. It was essentially a smallpox plague. We've got our own pandemic. I mean, these times are very similar, and the pressures on leaders who are trying to maintain order out of that chaos are the same. So I would highly encourage you, if you're a law enforcement officer and you've never thought, philosophy is not for me. Well, you have a philosophy. Philosophy is just the way that you live your life. But how's that going for you? How's that working out for you, as Dr. Phil would say, right? Maybe find a philosophy that is born out of chaos to help you manage that chaos a little better.
Yeah, and again, thank you for that kind of quick history lesson, because there's so much to it. And I, like you, really appreciate the lessons of Stoicism. And I think we may have talked about this before, but I appreciate ancient wisdom. And I started out by really learning about ancient wisdom through my yoga studies, yoga philosophy, which actually has quite a bit of crossover with Stoicism, which is why I think I'm so drawn to it. And in fact, my husband was the person who introduced me to Stoicism several years ago. He sends me links and articles when he finds things that he thinks I may like. And what I've kind of determined over the years is that this wisdom is, basically it's applying the knowledge that you have, that you've accumulated. And what you just said is something that's a common theme for me about how we are so much more similar than we are different. And then I think the Stoics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, because it's been a minute, but I've spoken about this before on a podcast. Sympatheia, I think, is the term that the Stoics may refer to as kind of like our version of what connection is, and how even today it's a good reminder that we have a lot more in common than we know, the people that even work within the same agency. But even like you said, with our ancestors. And so, yeah, the circumstances may be a little different, but we've been here before. We've lived through this, and really they had it figured out back then. And it's simple, but it's not, right? The philosophy is, it really hasn't changed. It's just the application of it, and people like you to bring it to us in a way, I think, that is really easy to digest. And, if you don't have the time to go back and learn, like it probably has taken you years to really understand and know all of the things that you know about this rich history. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, I've got a stack of, reference materials and books and everything. I mean, I felt like I don't have a PhD, but I felt like this is probably a little bit like what somebody going through a dissertation process has to do. They have to compile all the primary resources and all of that stuff. And I thought, this was great. I enjoyed that because, again, I came from a background with anthropology and history. My minor was in history. I enjoy that stuff and learning about that stuff. And so it was very natural to me when I got into this to really go down that rabbit hole and look for the primary sources and read and read and read. But there are a lot of modern resources that are doing similar things to what I've tried to do here, where you try to synthesize it and make it something that is digestible for people in the modern context. Ryan Holiday does a great job with that with his Daily Stoic podcast. He does that with his various books that he's put out. He's got about a dozen books out there that are very digestible, and they do a similar thing to what I'm trying to accomplish, which is contextualizing this philosophy into a modern context. And they talked a lot. You mentioned, we're all kind of connected. They talked about the logos being the universe, right? And the logos was a very, the philosophy isn't a theology. They're not talking about God in the sense that, a Christian might. They're talking about the universe in terms of what is the rational world around us, right? The world just is, and what it's rationally going to do. What the ants and the bees and the birds are going to do on a daily basis is part of their nature. It's part of their ration, and that is the logos. That's the universe around us. And Marcus Aurelius put it well. He said, what is bad for the bee is bad for the hive. In other words, like what we do that is outside of our nature is bad for the society and the community around us. So we need to live in accordance with our nature. We need to focus on being who we're supposed to be and working hard every day. And he makes reference to, when I'm not wanting to get up from bed in the morning and I want to stay cuddled under the covers. He makes reference to the birds and the bees. He's like, they get up and do their job. They get up and go about the work that they're supposed to do. I should do the same. That is what is natural, and that is what is expected of me. And there's just a lot of wisdom like that. That's so 2,000 years ago, 2,400 years ago, you're right. They had it figured out in a lot of ways. They had this rational thought process about the world around us that I think in our modern world, where we are so addicted to the smartphone, where everything comes easily, we push a button and we have our Amazon order delivered 2 hours later, we've forgotten a lot of that. We've forgotten a lot of the natural truths and the rational truths about the world around us. We believe that everything works for us, and we've stopped recognizing that no, the world still is a very rational place. You still have very little control over most of what's happening. Most of what's happening is going to happen whether you want it to or not. And reminding ourselves of that, I think, is very useful in a modern world where so much of we're just the stimulus that we're receiving all the time. We don't take time for that mindfulness. We don't take time to recognize what we do control and what we do not anymore, because so much is coming at us all the time. So I really enjoy it for that. It puts me in a place where it turns on some self-awareness. It turns on some reflective tendencies that we push aside when we've always got a podcast in our ears or whatever. So finding that time, even if it's 1 or 2 minutes a day, to read something from an ancient source of wisdom, integrate it a little bit through a modern context, can do wonders for your mindset, either on your way to work, on your way home from work, wherever it is. Finding that spot where you can have that mindfulness is huge.
Yes. And even if you're somebody like me, for instance, who really for the past decade has been learning and studying and trying to apply and live my life in a different way than I probably did before, I still need reminders every day. Because I will tell you, one of the virtues, obviously, of Stoicism is courage. And, some things that have been occurring in my life recently, I listened to one of your podcasts, in getting ready for this, but really, actually, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I needed to hear today. Thank you very much, Kristofor.
Awesome.
So it's really helpful to have those reminders, even if it's something that you already know, because it is easy for it to kind of slip away and kind of go into the background. And so I think what you're doing with your podcast and just the way that you've laid your book out is so helpful, because people do need these daily reminders, because growth and, like this whole self-study and learning and growing and transformation, it's something that you have to do continually throughout your life. It's not just, oh, I'm going to read this book and now I'm done, check. So that's what I really appreciate about what you're doing. And maybe what you could do is, since I brought up the virtues of Stoicism, do you mind just kind of quickly getting into what those virtues are and how they apply to the first responder or law enforcement culture?
Yeah. So, and if you're a Christian, and I'm a Christian, and so I have I have this um, kind of reverence for virtue
Hmm.
that's born out of being raised in the church, and it's very similar. There's a lot of Christian theologians, early theologians, who will tell you that the Stoics got closest to the Christian faith tradition in terms of how they saw the world, even though they existed prior to the birth of Christ, and they were not religious per se, but they talk about a lot of the same things as Thomas Aquinas does, 500 years later, when he's talking about virtues and having these sort of virtues of a humble and valorous life. And so courage, we talked about, obviously, temperance, justice, and wisdom are the other three. And I think, I can't think of a better operating system for a law enforcement officer than those four virtues. If obviously we need courage every day just to put our gun belt on, just to step out into that war zone outside of our front door and go out there into our community and, again, try to maintain order and chaos. We need to have a sense of right and wrong, and that's really what justice is. It's having a sense of right and wrong, not just right and wrong from a legal perspective, but right and wrong from a moral and ethical perspective. We need to practice self-discipline. That's really what temperance is. We need to have a understanding of what we're capable of, what we can endure, what we cannot, what is right for us, what is right for others around us, and being self-disciplined enough to temper some of those base instincts. We have so many people in the law enforcement community that fall into addiction issues, that fall into abuse issues in their personal lives and their relationships, because they don't manage that very well. That self-discipline, that temperance. We see what happens when people are in a squad car for 5 years. We see what happens to their waistline. We see what happens to their inability to temper those appetites or to find healthy ways to escape the boredom of the job sometimes. All of that comes down to self-discipline. Now, if you listen to a 𝘍𝘭𝘠 𝘠𝘠𝘠 or a David Goggins, they're kind of modern-day Stoics from that perspective, right? They're really heavy on that self-discipline aspect of things. And I suppose courage as well. I mean, they're both Navy SEALs. That takes a hell of a lot of courage.
Sure.
And then wisdom, being the last one, is the one that really, I think, it's the prove me wrong. And Marcus Aurelius wasn't saying that like in a cocky way. He was saying that like, it's the truth I'm after. If you can show me a better way or a different way, I'm all ears. And what a great message for police leaders. Now, how often do we have that appeal to authority? How often do we have that I've got the rank, so I've got the title, so I'm the expert? And the reality is, the guy coming fresh out of the academy might actually have a better perspective or better view if you open up your ears and listen. So it should be the truth that you're seeking. You should always have that as your North Star, that wisdom, the ability to recognize the situation for what it is and to make the best out of it and to take the best ideas, no matter who they come from, should supersede ego, should supersede rank, should supersede title. I can't think of a better operating system for law enforcement. After 15 plus years of law enforcement, where I saw the best and the worst of the profession, I can't think of four virtues that are more necessary to do that job and do it well.
Thank you for that breakdown. And I agree 100%. In fact, you made me think of something when you first started out by kind of equating it to your faith. And what I appreciate about Stoicism is that I don't consider myself to be a very religious person. I didn't grow up like that, but I am spiritual. And so what I like about Stoicism is that it is non-secular. Even though there's definitely crossover with like what you said with Christianity and a lot of other things, if that isn't something that resonates with a first responder or anyone listening, it's something that is just, it doesn't include any of that. I guess that's not something that's necessary for you to buy into it. It's very practical, which I appreciate. And
And I
Go
looked
ahead.
at it as there's 800,000 cops in the United States, and they might come from a whole bunch of faith traditions or none whatsoever. But we all need an ethical and moral foundation, and Stoicism has a great And it's relatable if you are Christian. It's relatable if you are, of the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith. It's relatable if you're secular. It's relatable if you're spiritual. You mentioned earlier the crossover between Eastern traditions, right? Not just that, not just the Eastern traditions, which talk a lot about this, about self-control. The samurai talk a ton about that. If you read the Book of Five Rings, it's all about self-discipline, self-control. The Toltecs in Central America talked about this. This was if you ever read the four agreements, it's about Toltec wisdom that occur. This is 1,500 years removed from the Stoics, and they're having the same conversation in Central America, a long ways away. So yeah, that idea that is presented here is not earth-shattering, groundbreaking, oh my gosh, we really need to consider this new way of looking at things. No, it was understood and recognized by ancient cultures around the world. We just need to come back to it.
Yeah, and it really doesn't matter what you call it or which philosophy or religion kind of is the one that that resonates with you, because I feel like it's with the principles, the underlying foundation is what's important, because not everyone is going to, want to study yoga philosophy or Stoicism or Christianity, but it's the principles behind it to me that are important. And I do want to ask you, because you mentioned this specifically, and this is something I wanted to talk about anyway. You mentioned truth, and so in your book, and I don't want to give too much away. I don't think I will by saying this. You have it broken down into every month, and then you have every day, you have, a quote and some Stoic wisdom and a journaling prompt, which I love that layout. How is it that you decided or came upon the themes for the month? Because I did notice that one of the months you did theme at truth. And the reason why that has stood out to me personally is because my word of the year, which I always choose one, I don't know if you do that. I've done it for the last 5 or 6 years. It's truth, but it's actually a word that comes from yoga philosophy. That Sanskrit is the language of yoga, and it's called Satya, Satya, but the translation is truth, and that is something that really has been on my mind for a while, and so it is so much so that it's my word of the year. So that specifically stood out to me, and I wanted to ask you how you came up, not just with that one, but all of the themes, because there's so many probably different directions you could go with that.
Yeah, I looked at it actually as there's 4 cardinal virtues, but each one has sub-virtues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, within courage, there's going to be different versions of that, different ways to talk about that. And so that was kind of how I organized the book. I looked at it as 3 sub-virtues per virtue.
Got it.
Kind of how I had it organized. And
Okay.
so if you go through, you'll see, I think there's one that's sobriety. That would fall under temperance, obviously. And so each one is kind of a sub-virtue, is a different way to talk about the same concept. And so as you're going through the year, you have, I didn't make it so overt that it's these 3 months are for this, but they really are. It's the first 3 months are going to be for this, the next 3 for this, the next 3 for this, the next 3 for that. And it's just different ways to talk about the same concept. It's different ways to bring in perspective on that topic. And so truth, it's interesting that you said that. My wife has this thing that she always comes back to when she's in a moment where she's trying to decide which direction to go. She always asks herself, what is true? And that is kind of her grounding sort of philosophical question that she asks herself, what is true? And she asks her clients that same thing, what is true? Because people get wound up. They get in their heads about like, oh, this is a mess, this is that, this is whatever, so-and-so doesn't like me, this is happening to me, the world is conspiring against me. And if you sit back and you ask yourself, what is true? What you realize is very little of, as Seneca would say, we fear so much more in imagination than in reality. And when you sit back and you ask yourself what is true, when you focus on the truth of any scenario, of any situation that you're in, what you realize is, again, that Stoic principle of what is true is I control this.
Exactly.
I control this internal thing and not everything else, not this other chaos around me. So I love that. I think that's a foundational principle of the philosophy.
Yeah, and for me too, it's what is true now, but it's also what is my truth and speaking my truth. There's a whole bunch of different things that kind of come with that for me. And so it's just a good daily reminder, because when I have my word, it's up on my mirror. It's, I usually get like some kind of bracelet that year with that reminds me of that. That's definitely a part of your book that I'm going to make sure I read even though it may not be in order of where we're at in the time of year, I may just start reading that ahead of time.
Yeah, read where you're at. That's what I
Yeah.
tell people. People have asked, like, how do I use this book? It's just like any other daily devotional. My friend Adam Davis, who's a well-known police, he's from the law enforcement background, but he's a well-known public speaker. He works with Team Never Quit. He wrote a book called 365 Daily Devotions for Law Enforcement. The book is called, actually, Behind the Badge, 365 Daily Devotions for Law Enforcement, all from a biblical Christian perspective. And it's the same idea there. Like, if you pick up this book, flip to the page for the day that you're on, spend 2 minutes with it, and it's going to give you some mindset tools. It's going to give you a way to think about that Stoic affirmation, that Stoic quote. It's going to give you some way to contextualize it, and it's going to give you a prompt to tell you, go out and do this, to integrate that. And I think that integration is such an important thing, because you mentioned this earlier. We read books. We all like to read books, and we all like to pick up some wisdom. We listen to a podcast. We pick up some wisdom. What I'm trying to do, and what I want to do now with my podcast and with the book, is to give people some tools to take away from that. Like, not just I listened and that was a great conversation, but give me a journal prompt, give me an action item. What can I do to take this lesson and practice it right now? Because as with anything, as with your law enforcement career, as with mine, as with yoga, as with triathlon for me, those hobbies, you don't get good at those things just by listening to a podcast or reading a book. You have to practice it. You have to practice the philosophy behind it. You have to work hard to get better. You have to do it so many times that it would be impossible for you to fail at it. And so many people miss that part. And so the integration, I think, is super important. Having that word that centers you, that matters. It's on your mirror. It's a part of your daily life. It's a grounding principle for you. That is hugely important. A lot of people do that. They do it with a vision board. They do, they set intentions. Stoicism has a lot of those elements. Yeah, it's not like the influencer standing there and, taking the selfie and talking about gratitude and everything. It's actually practicing it. It's actually doing the thing. It's actually being grateful. It's having those exercises in your life that bring you back to what is true.
Yeah, and you made me think of something that I heard on a different podcast, and I've talked about it, I think, even on one of my own podcasts because it was so meaningful to me. It's a term called the magnetism of depth. So if you're someone who, I know I love that, and
that's great.
When we're done, I'll tell you which podcast it was, and there was actually somebody who wrote a book that you may be interested in. Can't think of the name right now, but I will. But what it meant to me, and what it's when you practice these things yourself, which is a daily occurrence. It's not like we talked about before, one and done. This magnetism of depth just simply means like you're doing it for yourself, but in terms of like our law enforcement environment, especially if you're a leader, and there's leaders at all levels, as we know, by you doing those things yourself, you're helping others. Because even though you may not be speaking it out loud, people can sense when you've got those people that are living according to their values and their beliefs, and they're practicing things. So anyhow, you just made me think of that magnetism of depth. I just love that phrase.
There's a Latin phrase called acta non verba, which is essentially that. It means actions, not words, right? Acta non verba. So and Marcus Aurelius tells us that. Don't tell people what your philosophy is. Demonstrate it. Live it.
Exactly.
Don't don't talk about practicing gratitude and X, Y, and Z. Actually, just do the thing. Right? Like we spend so much time, and this is again Marcus Aurelius, but he says we spend so much time arguing what it is to be a good man. Be one. Just be one. Like, stop arguing about how I should become a good man, and do the thing that you should do, and do it every day. And the best leaders I had in my law enforcement career, and I bet it's the same for you, were the ones where I didn't have to ask them what they thought about something, because they demonstrated every day the kind of person they are. They led by example, and those are the people you want to follow, versus the people who led by that appeal to authority. I have rank, therefore do what I say, versus I'm leading from the front. I'm showing you how it should be done, and you're going to follow me because you want to follow somebody who is working as hard as you, who would never ask you to do something that they haven't done themselves or don't demonstrate the competence in. You trust in their decision making because they make good decisions on a daily basis by doing what they said they were going to do, versus that appeal to authority, the guy who just happens to have rank and title, and nobody respects that guy, right? So there are so many good lessons and wisdom here for law enforcement leaders especially. I write on my LinkedIn newsletter every week. I write with those people in mind. I have a large following on LinkedIn that that is about 15% police chiefs. And they're reading my newsletter every week that I put out, and I'm putting it out with them in mind. This is what Marcus Aurelius says about being a leader that you can apply right now in your departments to lead better, to show your philosophy, to live your philosophy instead of appealing to authority.
That's great, because there's so much there's so much there for leaders, especially given, just how things are a little bit more challenging. I mean, I guess they've always been challenging for police chiefs, but there's just a whole new set of circumstances that they have to deal with. And, it's challenging to be in this profession to begin with, but I often think about, because a lot of the people that I've grown up with in my career are now people that are leaders of agencies because we're old. And so not only do they have the burden and the challenges and the adversity and all the things that they've been exposed to throughout the course of their career, now they're tasked with having the responsibility of everyone else under them. And I know that's how they feel. And so I think it's really important to not forget about them, because oftentimes a leader will say, or an agency head will say, this is for the people below me. And that's a great attitude and philosophy and perspective to have, but we can't forget about supporting them. So I think it's great that you have individuals that are leading agencies. You're writing to them.
Yeah, and I'm not, targeting them like poking them in the shoulder or anything. But yeah, that's who, when I write those articles on LinkedIn, that's who I have in mind, because I think to myself, what are the tools that I wish some of my managers had? What are the things that I wish some people who were leading me had considered or thought of? And you don't always have that open door where you can, when you're in a law enforcement capacity, where you can walk in and be like, hey, listen, Gene, I think you need to do things differently. That doesn't happen very often. But if you can have someone from the outside kind of whispering in their ear, giving them some ideas that might benefit the people underneath them, it can't hurt. So that's what I've been trying to do, to spread the word as well. And I think there are so many we're all very self-led. We have to be self-led individuals to be in a law enforcement career, especially if you've ever been an 1811 or criminal investigator or a special agent. You're a very independent-minded person. You're probably an individual who, doesn't need to be told what to do very often. You probably know how to be self-led, how to go out and do your investigations and follow where they need to go. And this is a philosophy that really kind of doubles down on some of those natural instincts that you have as a law enforcement officer, and it encourages you to live in a way that is very self-disciplined and is very self-led. And I think that's a good thing. And then for anybody in a law enforcement capacity to get those lessons of leadership, whether you have rank and title or not, is going to make you better at what you do on a daily basis. It's going to make you better in a fast, uncertain, and rapidly evolving environment where you have to make decisions. And if you can root those decisions in core philosophical principles about what is right, what is true, you're going to make better decisions more often.
Yes. And really, when it comes down to it, the whole reason that I even started this podcast was to support law enforcement, first responders in all areas of wellness. And I look at this as being just such a big component of that, is that, whatever it is that works for you, in this case, we're talking about Stoicism, it entails all of those things. It's being, mentally, emotionally, physically, socially whole and well. And that's what I really appreciate about the philosophy, and how you are making it just so applicable for our specific culture. And like I said, just one page, little kind of snippets, because we all know that sometimes we don't have time to read, books and listen to hour-long podcasts like this one. And, our attention spans may not be what they once were. So I love how you've taken that, adapted it, and condensed it so that it can be, people can listen to it every day. And so with that, because I want to respect your time, if you don't mind speaking to how it is people can get a copy of your book and all of the other things. We didn't really talk much about some of these other things that you do, but if people are interested in learning more about hearing you speak, or what else you may be involved in, I would love for you to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. The best place to find all that information is my website, KristoforHealey.com. And my parents gave me the unfortunate Swedish spelling of Kristofor, so it's Kristofor. If you look up Kristofor Healey, just Google me, you'll find probably my Substack, which is where you can get my podcast for free. You can get my writing for free. That's a resource intended for first responders. My podcasts are, unless I have guests on, which I periodically do, my podcasts are 8 to 10 minutes long. They're very simple, digestible. I give you a Stoic quote. I give you some contextualization. I give you a journal prompt and some integration to take on your way. Very similar to what's in the book. So if you Google me, you can find my podcast. You can find, it's called the Stoic Responder. You can find that on Substack. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. You can find it on YouTube. And you can find links to my book there as well, In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart. Anywhere you get your books, you can get a copy. And if you want me to sign a copy for you, find me on my website. I can do that for you as well.
Great. And what about, are you still doing speaking engagements?
I am. I work with Team Never Quit. If you're familiar with Marcus Luttrell, he's a Navy SEAL. In fact, we're coming up on the 19th anniversary here next week of the incident that kind of made him famous. If you've ever done the Memorial Day Murph event, Marcus was the lone survivor from that ambush where Lieutenant Mike Murphy was killed. And so he runs a speakers bureau. He actually lives in my town, and they go out and they tell never quit stories. They tell the stories about how they overcame adversity, and he's got a great group of speakers. I'm kind of like on the lowest tier, but he's got guys like David Goggins on that speakers bureau, and himself, Taya Kyle, Chris Kyle's wife, is part of that speakers bureau. Just incredible people that they bring out into the community to tell stories of courage and overcoming adversity, and I'm just blessed to be a part of that and to get to speak on behalf of that organization. So if you're looking to have someone come in and speak about overcoming adversity, that's what I talk about.
Thank you, but don't underestimate yourself when you say you're on the lower end of that spectrum.
I mean, I'm in comparison to David Goggins, I'm happy to underestimate myself.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I as we wrap up, I am going to ask you if there's something that you want to leave the listeners with. But there was one thing you briefly mentioned. Can you talk or speak to the importance of journaling? You have journaling prompts. For those who, because I find that this is something that not a lot of people do. More and more people are journaling, but could you speak to why you added journaling prompts, what the intention is? Do you journal? What does that look like?
Yeah, and I journal every day, and I love to write. So for me, it's not really, I mean, I wrote a book. I write a lot on newsletters and Substack and things like that. So I enjoy writing, but it's an opportunity for me to, one, scratch a creative itch, and two, to put the words down on paper is different than to have them in your head, rattling around your head, right? Sometimes you put the words on the page and they just flow. Other times you really have to work to pull things out of you. But it's that integration that's super important. I'm sure you talk about this in yoga, in the philosophy around yoga. My wife talks a lot about this when she's talking about somatics and somatic experiencing, when she talks with her clients about that. She's a somatic experiencing practitioner. It's not enough to, it's like, let me give you an example. It's like these folks who go off to the jungles of Peru to do an ayahuasca retreat, right? So much of that ceremony isn't the actual plant medicine part of it. It's what you do to prepare your body for it and then to integrate the lessons you received from it. So you leave that ceremony, and the integration you do afterwards is as important. How you recognize what you saw, what you dealt with, what your emotions were, what you're feeling, and you put it down on the page and you move beyond those experiences. That's a lot what journaling can do for you. You internalize so much garbage, so much of that head junk that we all get. And the blank piece of paper in front of you, you can write down the worst, most awful things that you're feeling. You can rip that out, tear it up, and throw it away, and you got it out of your head. So I think it is an incredibly important practice for law enforcement in particular to have. I've heard guys that I worked with, they refer to it as their rage journal. You know, it's the stuff that they need to get out so that they're not internalizing this and letting it decay them. They get that out onto the page, they rip it up, they burn it, they throw it away. They never let anyone see it, but it's out of their system. And so I think this is an incredibly healthy perspective. It gives you a daily reminder. And you said one thing that I would leave the audience with. Seneca, every single day, the Stoic philosopher, he asks himself 3 questions. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? And what am I going to do better tomorrow? And if you just have that as your journal prompt every single day, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? What can I do better tomorrow? Even that is a massive, it's just a moment for self-awareness. It's a moment for recognizing where I'm at, where I can succeed, where I'm failing, and where I can bring myself back up to a level that I deserve to be at, my family deserves to have me at, my colleagues and community deserve to have me at. If you just do that every single day, it's a massive improvement in self-awareness.
Thank you. That is such a great place to end too, because you just dropped that resource, that tool for people, and like you said, not everyone wants to talk. And so this is just another option. Everybody has to find what works for them. So Kristofor, you're so enthusiastic and passionate about what you're doing. It comes across. I mean, obviously you and I can see each other, but I can see it in your face. And I appreciate when I get to meet someone who just truly and genuinely is doing the work that they're doing for the betterment of our culture. And so I thank you for that. And I'm so looking forward to actually using your book for personal use. And often what I will do is every time we have a quarterly peer support meeting at work, we run a peer support team. I've got about 60 members of our agency. I'll buy a book myself and I'll auction it or kind of raffle it off. And this is definitely one that's going to be next up.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate that. And I am so excited about what your agency is doing and others that are following your agency's lead. I remember having that conversation with you and just being so impressed by what y'all are doing in Wichita. So that is great. I hope other agencies follow that lead of having that sort of depth of a wellness program and peer support program. Just incredible.
Well, thank you, Kristofor. And thank you again for being on the podcast.
Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Kristofor Healey. Please check out his podcast and the links in the show notes for further information on how to work with him or contact him. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, if you found it valuable, please give us a share, subscribe, and maybe even write a review. And remember, we are better together.